L1, 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 L1. The following video will be an analysis of Sekiro's gameplay, presentation, and narrative themes. I'll also be comparing it to FromSoft's Souls games because I've been a fan of the franchise for a long time, and Sekiro stands out as the most unique among those games. I'll be spoiling much of the experience, so turn around now if you're so inclined. Sekiro's combat is without a doubt a huge step up from other Souls games. Many bosses devolve into pressing the dodge button at the right time. Blocking is blatantly worse than rolling, and parrying only works on a handful of enemies. Sure, your build can vary in a few interesting ways, but it's always going to come back to rolling at the right time. Not to say Souls combat is bad, it can be very satisfying. However, the more action games I play, the more combat in these games leaves me wanting more. Sekiro has 4 main methods of avoiding damage, and most boss fights will ask you to perform at least 2 of these methods: parrying, dodging, jumping, and Mikiri counter. Being forced to mix between 4 maneuvers instead of just one introduces complexity. Parrying by itself is already more engaging because it requires more precise timing, especially if you're on New Game Plus without Kuro's charm. That's to say nothing of the more situational abilities such as lightning reversal, umbrella shields, or the grappling hook that can be used to avoid damage as well. The posture system rewards players for keeping the pressure on the opponent and keeping the action going. This focus on defense and posture has increased the skill ceiling while delivering some of the most satisfying combat I've ever experienced. The prosthetic tools all find a comfortable niche somewhere in the game and add another set of options for the player to progress. The shuriken are the most versatile. As the only long-range option, it's always nice to have on hand. The axe is a solid heavy attack and can make Wolf an unflinching Beyblade if that's your thing. The firecrackers stun enemies and basically give you a free hit. It's especially useful against animals. Sabi Maru speeds up Wolf's combo, and its poison is especially effective against certain enemies. The loaded umbrellas, as I mentioned before, are great extensions of the defensive arsenal. Burning enemies with the flame vent makes them recover posture slower and can buff Wolf's sword. Divine Abduction feels more like a novelty, but seeing how it works on bosses, it can be somewhat practical. The finger whistle was probably intended to add to the stealth gameplay. However, I never really found a good time to utilize it. Fortunately, the Malcontent upgrade gives it another use. The Mist Raven is a catch-all dodge that could have trivialized the gameplay, but it's balanced well. You're never going to beat a boss by spamming it, unlike similar abilities in other games. Even the Spear, which I'd say is the most useless, is good for beginners. On my first playthrough, it was the low-risk attack that I'd often lean on. The weapon arts, however, aren't as well integrated as the tools. Most of them are fine moves, however, only having access to one at a time doesn't feel right. You could pause in the middle of combat to change your weapon art, but I shouldn't have to explain why that's a bad solution. I think in a different game the weapon arts would be button combos, giving the player access to all of them at all times. Because Sekiro uses the bumper buttons for combat and every other button besides the touchpad is occupied, it's understandable why this didn't happen. But understanding that doesn't make the weapon arts integrate into the game any better. The most notable difference between Sekiro's presentation and those of the past Souls games is how there's a definitive main cast. Having a group of NPCs that are vital to continue the game, along with tangible relationships with a player character who has his own fleshed out personality and backstory, drastically changes the framing of the narrative. I can comfortably say the primary characters of Sekiro are more developed and lend more to the events taking place than any counterparts in the other Souls games. However, that's not the whole story. Solaire's death hits so hard because he's a friend you chose to spend time with. Every NPC in FromSoft's other games are generally only as involved as the player wants them to be. You can ignore them, talk to them, befriend them, or even kill them. This lent to the atmosphere and immersion the Souls games excel at. They put the world and the experience of it before any characters, plot, or even gameplay. Before, when I was talking about Dark Souls' evasive options, I neglected to mention why they were so simple. It's to underpower the player and immerse them deeper into the world. You can even see this in how the music is used. Every location in Sekiro has music, while the other Souls games reserved music for bosses and specific areas. It's no coincidence that this is the first game to give you advice with controls instead of item descriptions in the load screens. I think that's a good indication of what Sekiro's focus is. Sekiro still has deep lore to discover, interesting locations to explore, and even NPCs that you can interact with at your own discretion. It's not completely devoid of atmosphere, far from it. I'd argue it's more atmospheric than most action games. It's just not as atmospheric as its predecessors. This isn't to criticize Sekiro necessarily, just to acknowledge what's been lost. Sekiro is a story about men growing old and abusing those younger than them to try and reclaim some bit of youth. They prey on those that they can control through conditioning or force. Owl is the most blatant example, treating Wolf as a tool to be used, going so far as to ask him to kill those he comes to care for just to amass power. If Wolf obeys and fights Emma and Ishin, he's swallowed by hatred, kills most of the cast, and then the game ends. My favorite thing about the Shura ending is how it subtly handicaps the player on New Game Plus. It prematurely ends the game so the player will miss up to 7 attack boosts and a handful of prayer beads. It's an effective metaphor for bad karma in a second life. If Wolf refuses Owl, he outgrows his father, becomes his own man, and eventually fights Ishin, a man who would sacrifice his grandson to reclaim his lost strength.
Sekiro.
Ishin calls Genichiro pitiful, and their respective boss fights certainly leaves the impression that Ishin in his prime was by far the better fighter. However, in the inner memory version of his boss fight, Genichiro continued to improve, eventually mastering his late master's greatest technique, Sakura Dansu! But the reality is, Ishin ripped that potential away from his grandson, just to relive his days of war again. After Wolf defeats Ishin, one of 3 endings takes place. Immortal Severance has Wolf failing to save Kuro, and taking Sekijo's place as the sculptor, with implications that he'll fall to Shura later in life. It gives a bitter feeling that probably motivated many players into trying again for something better, which is a good choice as it's the easiest ending to get. Purification involves Wolf sacrificing his life to save Kuro's. In spite of obtaining everything Ishin and Owl could ever want, immortality, the mortal blade, and the greatest sword skills in all of Ashina, Wolf doesn't hesitate, and Kuro grows up inspired to live up to Wolf's sacrifice. The final ending, Dragon's Homecoming, is considered the true ending, and unfortunately, I don't find it to be particularly interesting. It strikes me as sequel bait, and if it's not sequel bait, it just looks like an ambiguous cop-out of the tragedy so prevalent in the rest of the story. While I can't deny part of me is happy to see an optimistic ending for these characters, I also can't deny that I believe the other three endings are more true to the themes and tone of the story. Overall, Sekiro highlights and drastically improves some of the strengths of the Souls games while cutting back on others, simultaneously making for a more homogenized and specialized experience. I can name some other action games with combat as good or better than Sekiro's, and the other Souls games have better atmosphere than Sekiro, but I can't name many games that strike as comfortable a balance between those true attributes as Sekiro does. Whether that's a good thing or not is ultimately up to the individual, but I'm glad to see the team is willing to stray further from the Demon Souls formula. After all, we have Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2, Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne. I can probably play new games using that formula forever, but something different can be just as exciting.
Sekiro. I command thee now!
Brandish the Elden Ring. For all of us.
Dark Souls on horses! Miyazaki, take my money!
気が利くな。どれ酔いさぎじゃ勝ち戦の時はこうして飲んだものよ。足なしの皆でな。国取り戦の足なし。国取りか。